Okay.
It's on some chart right here that's saying the truck, there was a truck that must have backed up right here, that's here, right?
Okay. Is that okay? Back up, please. Back up. Back.
Oh my God.
Okay, back up, please. Back up.
Officers report to a seemingly routine.
On the morning of November 3, 2024, the cold air across Grant County, Washington cut through the silence. Just outside Moses Lake, investigators moved carefully through a remote stretch of land near Cascade Valley. Family members had been searching for 75-year-old Richard Andrews for days. Now, deputies believed they were close to finding answers. The area was quiet. Only the sound of wind moving through dry brush and boots pressing into loose dirt. Then investigators noticed something unusual. Partially hidden beneath disturbed soil was a black garbage bag. At first glance, it looked like illegal dumping, the kind officers occasionally find along isolated rural roads. But when detectives moved closer, the scene changed instantly. Inside the bag were human remains. According to investigators, those remains belonged to Richard Andrews, a grandfather and longtime Moses Lake resident who had recently vanished without explanation. What had started as a missing person case immediately became a homicide investigation. And as detectives began reconstructing Richard's final days, their attention turned toward someone close to him. Very close. Not a stranger. Not a random intruder. But Richard Andrews' own grandson, 27-year-old Isaiah Thomas. Investigators later revealed that the two had been living together at a home on Dale Street in Moses Lake. Neighbors would later describe the residence as quiet. Ordinary. Nothing about it stood out. But according to court documents and statements released by authorities, detectives began uncovering evidence suggesting something violent may have happened inside that home before Richard's body was transported and buried. As crime scene investigators processed the property, and detectives gathered witness statements, forensic evidence, and timeline details, one question began hanging over the entire case. What happened inside that house? And how did a missing grandfather's disappearance end with human remains hidden inside a garbage bag beneath the dirt? Welcome back to Dark Case Files, where we dig beneath the headlines to understand the full story. Before we begin, a content note. This case involves homicide, the concealment of human remains, and allegations of violence within a family. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand what happened in this investigation, you first need to understand who Richard Andrews was. Richard Andrews was 75 years old. According to information released by investigators and accounts from people in his community, he was described as quiet, steady, and familiar, the kind of person who stayed rooted in the same place long enough that neighbors didn't need to wonder where he had gone. He lived in Moses Lake, Washington, a working agricultural and industrial community in Grant County, where life often moves at a slower pace, and people tend to notice when something is out of place. Richard was not known for controversy. Not known for conflict. Just a long life lived in relative simplicity. He had family nearby, including his grandson, Isaiah Thomas, who was 27 years old at the time. The two shared a home in the Moses Lake area. And at face value, that detail alone would not have raised concern. Multi-generational living is common across Washington state and throughout the United States, especially when families are managing financial pressure, aging health concerns, or simply trying to stay connected. But according to investigators, what appeared normal on the surface may have been masking something far more complicated behind closed doors. In the days leading up to Richard Andrews being reported missing, nothing immediately suggested a violent crime to the outside world. But as law enforcement later reconstructed the timeline, they began focusing on subtle disruptions, the kind of details that only become meaningful after the fact. Missed contact. Unanswered calls. A sudden absence from routines that had once been consistent. Family members reportedly grew concerned when they were unable to reach Richard. And when those concerns escalated into a formal missing person report, investigators in Grant County began treating the situation with urgency. Because in small communities like Moses Lake, experience has taught authorities that silence is sometimes the first warning sign. As deputies and detectives began looking into Richard Andrews' disappearance, they didn't yet know they were stepping into a case that would quickly shift from uncertainty to something far more serious. A welfare check turned into a missing person investigation. A missing person investigation turned into a search effort. And that search would ultimately lead them to a remote stretch of ground outside the city, where evidence suggested something had been deliberately hidden. But before that discovery was made, investigators had to understand the last known chapter of Richard Andrews' life. Who he had last been seen with. Where he had last been. And what changed in the hours or days that followed. Because somewhere in that timeline was the moment everything went wrong. And at the center of that timeline was the home he shared with his grandson. A home that, according to neighbors, looked completely ordinary. Too ordinary, in hindsight. And as investigators would soon learn, ordinary can sometimes be the most dangerous illusion of all. In the months leading up to November 2024, Richard Andrews' life in Moses Lake, Washington appeared, on the surface, to follow a familiar rhythm. According to investigators and accounts from people familiar with the situation, Richard was the kind of man who lived quietly and predictably. Days passed in steady routines. The same familiar surroundings. The same small patterns that define long-term life in a close-knit community. Neighbors in Grant County would later describe him in simple terms: someone you saw, greeted, and recognized. Not someone who drew attention, but someone whose absence would immediately feel noticeable. At 75 years old, Richard was in a stage of life where independence often becomes more fragile. Daily routines matter more. Contact with family becomes more important. And even small disruptions begin to stand out. And Richard's life, according to early reporting and investigative summaries, was still closely tied to family. Most notably, his grandson, Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas, 27 at the time, lived in the same household as Richard Andrews. Publicly available information and investigative details indicate that the arrangement was not unusual in structure. Multi-generational households are common, especially in working-class communities where shared living can provide financial and practical support. But investigators later began to examine whether that arrangement also carried underlying tension that was not visible to the outside world. Neighbors did not initially report loud disputes or obvious conflict. From the outside, the home on Dale Street appeared quiet. Ordinary. Even stable. But as detectives would later learn, appearances inside a residence do not always reflect what is happening behind closed doors. In the days before Richard Andrews was reported missing, small disruptions began to emerge. At first, they were not treated as alarming. Missed calls. Delayed responses. Unreturned messages. Family members attempting to reach Richard reportedly became increasingly concerned as time passed without contact. For someone who maintained consistent communication, the silence began to feel wrong. And in cases like this, investigators often emphasize that it is not one single detail that signals danger, but the pattern of absence that begins to form around it. As law enforcement in Grant County began reconstructing Richard Andrews' final known movements, they worked backward through the last confirmed points of contact. The last ordinary days. The last moments where nothing yet appeared unusual. According to early investigative timelines, Richard was last believed to be at or near his residence in Moses Lake. No confirmed public activity followed that point. No reliable sightings placed him elsewhere afterward. Just a quiet stop in the record. The kind that only gains meaning once everything else falls apart. Neighbors, when later interviewed, provided fragments of observation. A quiet street. A home that did not appear disturbed from the outside. No immediate indication that anything serious had occurred. And yet, in hindsight, even silence becomes evidence investigators return to again and again. Because in missing person cases that later turn into homicide investigations, the absence of activity often becomes just as important as the presence of it. At the time, it did not seem important. Later, detectives would revisit that detail again and again. As the timeline tightened, investigators began focusing on the household itself. The shared residence between Richard Andrews and his grandson, Isaiah Thomas. At first, Isaiah was not publicly labeled as a suspect. Instead, he became part of the effort to understand Richard's final hours. But as detectives gathered statements and began comparing accounts, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Small gaps in timing. Details that did not fully align across different conversations. And responses that, according to investigative interpretation, raised more questions than they answered. Not dramatic contradictions. Not immediate evidence of guilt. But enough to shift attention. Enough to deepen scrutiny. As the missing person investigation developed, authorities also worked to confirm a precise timeline, when Richard was last seen, who had contact with him, and what changed afterward. But in cases like this, timelines are rarely clean. They are reconstructed piece by piece. Through memory. Through surveillance. Through fragmented witness accounts. And every new detail has the potential to either clarify the picture, or make it more complicated. What investigators eventually began to focus on was not just Richard Andrews' disappearance itself, but the environment immediately surrounding it. The household. The relationships inside it. And the last known moments before silence took over. Because somewhere in that transition, between normal life and sudden absence, something irreversible had happened. Something that had not yet been publicly explained. And as detectives continued building their case file, the focus slowly narrowed toward one unavoidable center point. The home on Dale Street. The place Richard was last known to be. The place where, investigators believed, the timeline stopped making sense. And the place where answers might still be waiting, hidden behind closed doors. By the time detectives entered the home on Dale Street, they already feared Richard Andrews was never coming back alive. After Richard Andrews was officially reported missing, the response from authorities in Moses Lake began in a methodical but urgent way. Family members had already expressed growing concern, not just about his absence, but about the lack of any meaningful contact in the days surrounding it. According to publicly released investigative information, officers conducted initial welfare checks at the residence Richard shared with his grandson, Isaiah Thomas. At first, there was no immediate indication of a crime. No obvious signs of forced entry were publicly reported in those early stages. No clear evidence that would immediately confirm foul play. But investigators have explained in similar cases that the absence of visible evidence is not the same as the absence of suspicion. Because what matters just as much as what doesn't add up. And in this case, there were already small inconsistencies beginning to form. Richard was not someone who typically vanished without explanation. His routines, according to family accounts, were stable. So when contact stopped entirely, investigators treated the case with increasing seriousness. What began as a missing person report quickly escalated into a structured search effort. As the investigation expanded, Grant County authorities began coordinating with additional agencies. The focus shifted from checking immediate locations to reconstructing movement patterns. Detectives began interviewing neighbors, family members, and anyone who may have seen Richard in his final known time frame. At the same time, search areas expanded outward from Moses Lake into surrounding rural terrain, open land, and low-visibility areas where someone could potentially conceal evidence without immediate detection. The geography itself became part of the investigation. Wide stretches of land. Sparse traffic. Areas where visibility drops quickly once you leave main roads. And in missing person cases, those environments often become priority search zones. Because time is critical. And concealment is always a possibility investigators must consider. It was during one of these expanded search efforts that investigators moved into a more remote section of Grant County land near Cascade Valley. The conditions were quiet. Cold air hung low over the terrain. The kind of environment where sound doesn't carry far, and movement feels amplified by silence. According to investigative accounts, searchers moved slowly through uneven ground, scanning disturbed areas where soil and vegetation did not appear natural. There was no dramatic signal at first. No clear marker. Just subtle irregularity in the earth. And then, something partially exposed beneath the surface. A black garbage bag. Partially buried. Partially concealed. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as illegal dumping. A common enough occurrence in rural areas where isolated roads sometimes become disposal points. But the context of the search changed everything. This was not random cleanup duty. This was a coordinated missing person investigation. And so investigators approached carefully. When the soil was disturbed further, the contents of the bag confirmed what no one had wanted to find: human remains. According to investigators, those remains were later identified as Richard Andrews. The discovery immediately transformed the case. A missing person investigation was no longer just about finding someone alive. It was now a homicide investigation. Once the scene was secured, Washington State Patrol Crime Lab personnel were brought in to assist with evidence collection and documentation. The area was treated as a full forensic site. Every layer of soil was examined. Every disturbance was documented. Every surrounding detail was analyzed for trace evidence. Investigators noted that the burial conditions suggested intentional concealment. The placement, the depth, the covering. These were not random indicators. They pointed toward deliberate effort to hide a body after death. At this stage, investigators began forming early conclusions about sequence. That Richard Andrews had likely died before being moved. And that the location where he was found was not the location where the fatal event had occurred. That distinction became critical, because it meant the investigation was no longer just about where Richard was found, but where everything had started. As forensic teams worked the burial site, investigators reportedly began connecting emerging evidence back toward Richard Andrews' residence on Dale Street. But here's where the investigation takes a darker turn. Inside the home he shared with Isaiah Thomas, detectives began identifying inconsistencies that could not easily be explained away. Signs that suggested something may have happened inside the residence before the body was moved. According to investigative summaries, there were indications consistent with disturbance and possible attempts to manage or conceal evidence. Nothing was publicly released in full detail at this stage, but the direction of the investigation had clearly shifted. The home was no longer just a place of last residence. It was becoming a focal point of suspected events. As detectives refined their timeline, multiple forms of evidence began to converge. Cell phone data helped establish movements and communication gaps. Witness statements provided fragmented confirmation of time windows. And vehicle-related information became a key factor in understanding how evidence may have been transported. Investigators also noted behavioral inconsistencies in early interviews, particularly in relation to timing and sequence of events. None of these elements alone defined the case. But together, they created a narrowing focus. A tightening circle around one household. One timeline. One shared space between victim and suspect. And as that circle closed, investigators prepared to re-examine the interior of the home itself. Because they believed the most important evidence had not yet been fully understood. Inside the residence on Dale Street, investigators reportedly identified forensic indicators that deepened suspicion. Evidence consistent with disturbance. Possible traces suggesting cleanup activity. And details that, according to investigative interpretation, raised concerns about what had occurred prior to Richard Andrews being reported missing. There were also indications that supported the theory of movement, that Richard's body had been transported after death rather than remaining at the original location. At that point, Isaiah Thomas stopped being just a concerned family member in investigators' eyes. He became a central figure in a rapidly intensifying homicide investigation. For Richard Andrews' family, the discovery marked a devastating shift from uncertainty to confirmation of loss. The search that had begun with hope had ended in confirmation of death. And in a small community like Moses Lake, news like this does not stay contained. It spreads quickly. Quiet conversations in neighborhoods. Sudden silence in familiar places. A community trying to reconcile how something so severe could happen so close to home. Because the contrast was impossible to ignore. A quiet town. A familiar street. A normal-looking house. And a case that had now escalated into a homicide investigation involving a grandfather and his grandson. And even as investigators continued building their case, one critical question remained unanswered. The one question that still had no clear public answer. But detectives knew it would define everything that followed. Because they still didn't know the most important part of the case: motive. As the investigation into Richard Andrews' death developed, attention from law enforcement in Grant County increasingly centered on one individual. His grandson, Isaiah Thomas. At first, he had been part of the search narrative. A family member in the same household. Someone who, in theory, should have been helping investigators understand Richard's final days. But as evidence accumulated from the scene, the timeline, and the residence they shared, that role began to shift. Quietly at first. Then unmistakably. According to publicly available law enforcement reports from the Moses Lake investigation, Isaiah Thomas was ultimately arrested and charged in connection with the death of Richard Andrews. The charge listed in early reporting was second-degree murder. Once that information became public, the case shifted instantly from a missing person tragedy to a full homicide prosecution. And in a small community like Moses Lake, the reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had once described the area as quiet and uneventful now found themselves discussing something far darker. A grandfather. A grandson. And a home that had become the center of a criminal investigation. Local and regional media coverage intensified as more details emerged, though many key aspects of the case remained sealed within official court filings and investigative records. Based on investigative direction and early prosecutorial framing reported in public sources, authorities believed a sequence of events may have unfolded inside the residence on Dale Street. Their theory suggested Richard Andrews may have been killed inside the home he shared with Isaiah Thomas. From there, investigators believe efforts were made to conceal what had happened. That concealment allegedly included the movement of Richard's body away from the residence and its eventual burial in a remote rural area outside Moses Lake. The shallow grave, according to investigators, was not random, but part of an effort to delay discovery and obscure the timeline of death. Every element of the alleged sequence pointed toward intentional concealment rather than accidental disappearance. During early interactions with law enforcement, Isaiah Thomas reportedly provided statements regarding Richard Andrews' disappearance and the timeline leading up to it. However, investigators noted inconsistencies when comparing those statements to physical and digital evidence collected during the investigation. Different accounts of timing. Variations in sequence. Details that did not align with forensic reconstruction. It was a story detectives initially listened to carefully. But evidence kept pulling them in another direction. And in homicide investigations, contradictions do not sit quietly. They become pressure points. Points that investigators return to again and again. As the case progressed, investigators built a multi-layered evidentiary profile. First came forensic evidence collected from both the burial site and the residence. Then digital evidence, including phone activity and possible location data, which helped reconstruct movement patterns and communication gaps. Behavioral observations also became part of the investigative record, particularly during interviews conducted in the early phase of the case. Witness statements from the community added additional context, helping establish who had seen Richard Andrews last, and when. But the most significant development was not any single piece of evidence. It was how the timeline itself began to collapse under scrutiny. What initially appeared like a disappearance began to resolve into a tightly constrained window of time. A window in which something irreversible had occurred. Despite the direction of the investigation, not all questions were immediately settled. In early stages of cases like this, investigators must still consider alternative explanations, even when suspicion is growing. Was there another person involved? Could certain findings have been misinterpreted without full context? And most importantly, was motive fully understood at this stage of the investigation? Because even when evidence points in a single direction, motive often remains the most complex piece to confirm. And without it, even strong cases can feel incomplete. These questions remained part of the investigative process as the case continued to develop. As more information was reviewed, investigators began considering broader contextual factors within the household. Reports suggested potential underlying pressures that may have existed prior to the incident. Family dependency. Financial strain. And the complexities of shared living between an elderly relative and an adult grandchild. None of these factors, on their own, explain a homicide. But in many investigations, they become part of the psychological landscape detectives examine when trying to understand how violence escalates within domestic environments. Because sometimes the most dangerous conflicts happen behind the safest-looking doors. And in this case, that home on Dale Street was beginning to represent exactly that kind of contradiction. As details of the arrest became public, shock spread quickly through Moses Lake. Intrafamily violence cases often carry a different emotional weight in small communities. They are harder to process, harder to distance from, because they force people to reconsider what they thought they knew about those living nearby. Neighbors who had once described the area as quiet now spoke about disbelief. About the idea that something so severe could happen inside a home that, from the outside, appeared ordinary. For Richard Andrews' family, the focus shifted from searching to processing loss and confronting allegations that the person closest to him may have been involved. As the investigation moved forward, authorities believed they were closing in on a clearer narrative. A suspect had been identified. Evidence had been gathered. A timeline had been constructed. But homicide cases rarely resolve as neatly as they appear in early reports. Because while investigators believed they knew who committed the crime, the courtroom would become a completely different battle. As the investigation into Richard Andrews' death reached its most critical stage, law enforcement in Grant County moved from building a case to formally presenting it. What had begun as a missing person report in rural Washington had now become a homicide prosecution involving a grandfather and his grandson. And the legal system was preparing to take over where investigators left off. According to publicly released law enforcement information, Isaiah Thomas was arrested in connection with the death of Richard Andrews. He was charged with second-degree murder. Following his arrest, Isaiah was booked into custody and processed through the Grant County jail system, where standard procedures were carried out as the case transitioned into the judicial phase. Prosecutors stated that the evidence gathered during the investigation supported the allegation that Richard Andrews' death was not accidental, and that his body had been deliberately concealed after the fact. Those early statements set the tone for what would become a closely watched case in the local justice system. A case built not only on forensic findings, but on a deeply unsettling family connection. During initial court appearances, the focus shifted from the investigation itself to the legal arguments surrounding the charges. Bail became one of the first major points of discussion. The prosecution argued that the seriousness of the charge, and the nature of the evidence, warranted continued detention. The defense, as is standard in early proceedings, challenged aspects of the state's case and emphasized the need for full examination of evidence before conclusions could be drawn. Publicly available court reporting indicates that the case relied heavily on a combination of physical evidence, timeline reconstruction, and witness statements gathered during the investigation phase. At this stage, much of the detailed evidence remained part of official filings rather than public courtroom testimony. But the direction of the case was already clear. The legal process had begun. And both sides were preparing for what could become a complex and emotionally charged trial. As prosecutors outlined their position, several core elements defined the case. First, the burial site. The discovery of Richard Andrews' remains in a remote rural area, concealed beneath disturbed soil and a garbage bag, became a central point in establishing alleged concealment. Second, forensic findings. While specific details were limited in early public reporting, investigators indicated that physical evidence supported the conclusion that Richard's death occurred prior to his body being moved. Third, the investigative timeline. Law enforcement reconstructed a sequence of events that narrowed the window of disappearance and helped identify key inconsistencies in reported accounts. And finally, contradictions. Differences between statements, observed timelines, and physical evidence became a critical focus of the prosecution's narrative. Individually, each element required interpretation. Together, they formed the structure of the case being presented in court. In Moses Lake, the reaction to the case was immediate and deeply emotional. Fear spread through a community unaccustomed to violent crime of this nature, especially one involving such a close family relationship. Disbelief followed closely behind. People struggled to reconcile the image of a quiet neighborhood with the allegations emerging from official proceedings. In many small communities, cases like this do not remain abstract. They become personal. They are discussed in grocery stores, workplaces, and homes. And for many residents, the central question was not just what happened, but how something like this could happen so close to home. At the same time, informal memorial conversations began forming around Richard Andrews. A man who, until recently, had simply been part of the background of everyday life in his community. Now, he had become the center of a case that would define him in the public record. As the legal process continued, it remained clear that the case was still developing within the court system. As of today, the case against Isaiah Thomas has not yet fully played out in court. Proceedings remain ongoing, and any final determination of guilt or innocence rests with the judicial process. Isaiah Thomas is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. And like many homicide cases of this nature, the timeline from arrest to resolution is often measured in months, or even years. For investigators, the arrest marked the end of one phase of the case. But for the justice system, it marked the beginning of another. At the center of all legal proceedings, filings, and investigations, one fact remains unchanged. Richard Andrews was a 75-year-old man. He was a father. A grandfather. A member of the Moses Lake community whose life, by all accounts, was built quietly over decades of ordinary days. And now, his name exists in public record not for the life he lived, but for the circumstances surrounding his death. Cases like this do not just affect courtrooms. They affect families. They reshape communities. And they leave behind questions that no legal outcome can fully erase. For Richard Andrews' family, the horror wasn't just losing him. It was the terrifying allegation that someone within the family may have been responsible. A man who, by all available accounts, spent his life building something steady and familiar in Moses Lake, Washington. A quiet life. A predictable life. The kind of life that rarely makes headlines. And like so many victims in cases like this, his name only became widely known after tragedy struck. After the search. After the investigation. After the discovery that changed everything. Whatever ultimately happens in court, one fact remains unchanged. Richard Andrews is gone. And behind every legal filing, every police report, and every courtroom argument, there is a family trying to process an absence that cannot be undone. A missing voice. A missing presence. A missing place at the table that will never be filled again. Cases like this leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind questions that do not have easy answers. How does a situation inside a home go unnoticed until it becomes a criminal investigation? How do small signs, the kinds people often dismiss, sometimes turn out to be pieces of something far more serious? And how often do we only recognize those signs when it is already too late? In communities like Moses Lake, stories like this do not fade quickly. They linger in conversation. They sit in memory. They become part of how people see places they once thought were completely ordinary. But behind all of that is something much more personal. A family that lost someone they loved. And a case that still carries unresolved legal and emotional weight as it continues through the justice system. As of the latest public reporting, the investigation and court proceedings in this case remain ongoing. Any final determination will be made through the legal process, as more information becomes available and the case continues to move through the courts. If anyone has additional information related to this case, they are encouraged to contact the Moses Lake Police Department or Grant County authorities. Thank you for spending your time with me today. True crime stories are not just about what happened. They are about the people behind them, and the lives that are changed forever in a single moment. If you found this documentary meaningful, consider subscribing to Dark Case Files for more long-form true crime investigations. And let me know in the comments. What do you believe investigators still haven't fully explained about this case? Until next time. Stay curious. Stay safe.